Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling off? Not angry, not hurt, just slightly disoriented, like something shifted, but you can't point to the exact moment it happened. You replay the conversation later and think, wait, why did I agree to that? Why did I start explaining myself? Why do I suddenly feel like I'm the problem? Here's the strange part. Nothing obviously wrong was said. No raised voices, no insults, no dramatic confrontation. And that's exactly why it works. Most people assume manipulation is loud, obvious, easy to spot. But in everyday conversation, manipulation is quiet. It sounds reasonable. It hides behind politeness, concern, and just trying to understand. And if you miss it, the cost isn't one argument. It's clarity. Because the more often this happens, the more you start questioning your instincts, your memory, your sense of direction in conversations. You stop trusting what you noticed in the first place. That's what we're talking about today, not villains, not extreme scenarios, just the subtle conversational moves that slowly shift control, without ever announcing themselves. And once you recognize these patterns, something interesting happens. You don't get louder, you don't get defensive. You get calm, because you can finally see what's happening while it's happening. And from that point on, conversations don't control you anymore. Let's clear something up right away. This isn't about becoming suspicious of everyone you talk to. It's not about turning conversations into power struggles. And it's definitely not about winning. Most manipulation isn't intentional. People don't wake up thinking, who can I control today? They're trying to protect their image. Avoid discomfort. Keep leverage without admitting they want it. That's why everyday manipulation feels so normal. Because it blends into polite conversation. Here's the mistake most people make. They assume conversations are neutral. That if someone sounds calm, reasonable, or friendly, then the exchange itself must be honest. But conversation isn't just an exchange of information. It's an environment, and environments shape behavior. Who asks the questions? Who explains themselves? Who feels pressure to soften their words? Those things matter more than who's technically right. If you've ever noticed that certain conversations leave you energized, while others leave you second-guessing yourself, that's not personality mismatch. That's structure. Someone is steering the flow, often without realizing they're doing it. And here's where Carl Jung quietly enters the picture. Jung wasn't focused on arguments or persuasion tricks. He was watching how people unknowingly act out inner pressures during everyday interactions. He noticed that when people avoid something internally, it leaks into how they speak. Tone shifts, deflections, emotional pivots. So before we talk about what to say or how to respond, we need to talk about what's actually happening beneath the surface. Because once you see the structure of a conversation, the manipulation stops feeling mysterious, and that's when it starts becoming predictable. So let's slow this down for a moment. Before tactics, before labels, before deciding who's right or wrong, because if you jump straight into analysis, you miss the most important part, how manipulation actually enters a conversation. It doesn't crash the door, it slides in sideways. Carl Jung spent years paying attention to moments people skipped over. The pauses, the discomfort, the subtle changes in direction. He once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own inner conflicts." Now listen carefully. In conversation, that avoidance doesn't look dramatic. It looks like redirection. A topic gets uncomfortable, and suddenly, the focus shifts. The tone changes. The energy tightens, not because someone planned it, but because discomfort demands an exit. And here's the key point most people miss. Manipulation often begins before anyone speaks. It begins with pressure. Pressure to agree. Pressure to reassure. Pressure to keep things smooth. And the moment you feel responsible for maintaining that smoothness, the balance shifts. You start adjusting, clarifying, softening. The other person doesn't need to push harder. You're already moving. Jung understood that when people can't tolerate internal tension, they unconsciously transfer it outward, into the conversation, onto the other person. That's why some exchanges feel oddly heavy, even when nothing serious is being discussed. You're carrying more than your share. So as we move forward, don't just listen for clever phrasing. Listen for pressure. Because the moment you can feel it, you're no longer inside the manipulation. You're observing it. Let's talk about the first pattern you'll start noticing everywhere once you know what to listen for. This one is subtle. And because it's subtle, it's usually the most effective. I call it the emotional detour. Here's how it works. You bring up something clear. A decision. A boundary. A simple question that deserves a simple answer. And for a moment, everything is fine. Then without warning, the conversation turns emotional. Not explosive, not dramatic, just heavier. Suddenly, you're not discussing the topic anymore. You're discussing how the topic made someone feel. And that shift is important, because now the conversation has a new priority, keeping the emotional temperature stable. Notice what happens next. You start explaining yourself. You adjust your wording. You reassure. Not because you are wrong, but because the situation feels fragile. That's the detour. The original issue quietly fades into the background while emotional management takes center stage. And here's the critical detail. No one has to ask you to do this. The pressure is implied. Carl Jung once observed, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In everyday conversation, that darkness isn't something extreme. It's avoidance. Avoidance of discomfort. Avoidance of responsibility. Avoidance of direct engagement. So instead of answering the question, the conversation reroutes. And if you don't notice the turn, you'll spend the rest of the exchange responding to feelings instead of resolving anything. The giveaway. You leave feeling like you worked hard, but nothing actually moved forward. That's when you know the detour worked. And the moment you can name it, it loses its power. Because now, you're not reacting, you're tracking. Now let's move to the second pattern. This one doesn't rely on emotion. It relies on uncertainty. I call this the self-doubt injection. And once you notice it, you'll realize how often it shows up in everyday conversation. Here's what it sounds like. You make a clear observation, you point something out. You describe what you noticed, calmly and directly. And instead of addressing what you said, the response subtly shifts the spotlight onto you. Not aggressively, not rudely, just enough to destabilize your footing. Phrases like, "I think you're misunderstanding me." That's not how it happened. You're taking this the wrong way. Notice what's happening. They're not offering a clearer version of events. They're not correcting a fact. They're questioning your perception. And the moment that happens, the conversation changes lanes. Now you're explaining how you arrived at your conclusion, justifying your interpretation, reconstructing the moment in detail. You're on defense, without realizing when you stepped there. Carl Jung captured this dynamic perfectly when he said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." That irritation you feel in these moments, that tightening in your chest, that's not confusion. That's the moment your internal alarm goes off. Because deep down, you sense the shift. The issue is no longer the topic. It's your credibility. And here's why this pattern works so well. Most people value being seen as reasonable, fair, open-minded. So when your perception is gently questioned, you instinctively try to prove you're not being unreasonable. You start qualifying your words. Well, maybe I'm wrong, but I could be mistaken. I just felt like... And just like that, the original point loses strength. Not because it was wrong, but because certainty was quietly removed from it. The key signal? If you leave a conversation knowing less about your own position than when you entered it, something went sideways. Healthy conversation brings clarity. This pattern dissolves it. And once you recognize that, you stop chasing reassurance. You pause. You restate. You let the pressure sit where it belongs, because confusion is often the tool, not the outcome. And next, we're going to look at the pattern that feels the most harmless of all. The one that sounds like agreement. Now let's talk about the pattern almost everyone misses, because it doesn't feel threatening. It doesn't feel uncomfortable. It feels pleasant. This is the false agreement trap. On the surface, it sounds like progress. You explain your position. They nod. They say the right things. You hear, "I get what you're saying. That makes sense. I completely understand." And in that moment, your guard drops. Because being understood feels like resolution. But watch what happens next. Nothing changes. No decision shifts. No action follows. No outcome moves in your direction. The conversation ends on a note of harmony, but the situation stays exactly the same. That's the trap. Agreement becomes a substitute for movement. And because nothing overtly negative happened, you're less likely to question it. Carl Jung once said, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown." In conversation, false agreement creates the illusion of outgrowing an issue without actually addressing it. It signals closure where there is none. And here's why this pattern works so well. Most people don't want conflict. They want mutual understanding. So when someone mirrors your language and validates your feelings, it satisfies that need, even if the practical outcome stays frozen. You leave thinking, "At least they see my side." But seeing isn't the same as acting. The key question to ask yourself after these exchanges is simple. What changed? If the answer is nothing, then agreement was used as a pause button, not to end the conversation, but to end your momentum. Once you notice that, you stop mistaking warmth for progress, and that brings us to the deeper shift Jung was pointing toward all along. This is where everything comes together. Up to now, we've been talking about what manipulation sounds like, but Jung was always more interested in why it works, because these patterns don't succeed through clever wording alone. They succeed because they connect to something inside us. He put it this way: knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Set the dramatic phrasing aside for a moment and focus on the point. If you don't know where you feel pressure, someone else will feel it for you. If you don't know where you hesitate, someone else will lean there. Manipulation doesn't require force. It requires access. Access to your need to be understood, your need to be fair, your need to keep things calm. And those needs aren't flaws, they're human. But when you're unaware of them, they quietly shape your responses. You over-explain. You soften statements that don't need softening. You accept delays that were never agreed on. Not because you decided to, but because the pressure felt familiar. Jung understood that people often project what they can't handle internally into their interactions. And when that happens, the conversation becomes uneven. One person is regulating, the other is directing. So the real shift isn't learning clever comebacks. It's learning to notice when you start adjusting yourself. That moment, right there, is the signal. Because the second you notice it, the dynamic changes. You're no longer inside the pattern. You're watching it happen. And that awareness alone, begins to restore balance. Now let's talk about how to use that awareness in real time without escalating or shutting down. So what do you actually do in the moment? Not later. Not after you've replayed the conversation 10 times in your head. Right there, while it's happening. The first step is simple, but not easy. You stop chasing resolution, because the more urgently you try to fix the conversation, the easier it is to be steered. Instead, you slow the pace. Manipulation thrives on momentum. Clarity thrives on space. When the conversation suddenly gets heavier, or fuzzier, or oddly emotional, you don't rush to smooth it over. You pause, not dramatically, not confrontationally, just enough to let the pressure become visible. And here's the key shift. You return to the original point, not with new explanations, not with more justification, just by restating it cleanly. This does two things. First, it reveals whether the conversation is actually about the issue or about avoiding it. Second, it removes your participation from the detour. Carl Jung once noted, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." In conversation, manipulation often lives in that swing toward nonsense, where things feel vague, emotional, or undefined. By calmly returning to what's concrete, you anchor the exchange. Another powerful move, silence. Not passive silence, intentional silence. When you stop filling the space, the other person has to decide whether they're willing to engage directly. And if they aren't, that tells you everything you need to know. You don't need to label the behavior. You don't need to accuse. You just need to stop carrying the imbalance. Because the moment you stop compensating, the structure of the conversation reveals itself. And that's when control quietly shifts back to you. Now let's bring this home, because recognition isn't the end of the story. Let's talk about subtle warning signs. You're being manipulated. Before we wrap up, there's a critical layer most people completely miss. The tiny, almost invisible signals that something is off in a conversation. These are subtle, but they're consistent. And once you start noticing them, the whole dynamic changes. 1. The energy shift. Have you ever been talking and suddenly the conversation feels heavier, like someone subtly changed the rules, but you can't put your finger on how? Nothing was said that's overtly wrong. Nothing is loud or aggressive. And yet you feel a pressure in your chest, a tension in the air. That's the energy shift. It's a signal that the conversation is no longer about clarity. It's about control. And the tricky part, most people don't even realize it's happening until it's too late. 2. Repetition without progress. This is a classic. They keep circling back to the same points, asking the same questions, or revisiting old agreements, but nothing ever moves forward. On the surface, it feels normal, polite even. But look closer. No action is taken, no decisions are made. No real resolution happens. This is a subtle steering technique. It keeps you engaged, busy, and mentally invested, but the conversation's outcome remains entirely in their control. 3. Your mental load increases. Pay attention to how you feel after a conversation. Do you leave thinking, why do I feel like I need to explain myself so much? Why am I the one trying to keep the conversation calm? Did I just agree to something I didn't actually mean? If so, congratulations. You've just detected manipulation in action. Manipulation doesn't have to yell or argue. Often it works by loading your brain with responsibility for the tone, for the clarity, for their emotional state, so that the conversation slowly shifts to your control instead of theirs. 4. Losing track of the original point. This is subtle, but powerful. At some point in the conversation, you realize you've forgotten the original question, concern, or issue. That's no accident. Manipulation thrives in drift. By diverting focus, even gently, the other person keeps you occupied with tangents, clarifications, or emotional management, while the original goal quietly disappears. 5. The invisible pull toward approval. Sometimes, the most effective manipulation doesn't feel heavy at all. It feels polite, friendly, reasonable. They complement your insight, nod in agreement, or validate your perspective, just enough to make you feel good. Here's the trick. This creates a mental debt. You feel seen, so you instinctively soften your own stance, lower your defenses, or give up clarity just to maintain the harmony. These signals are subtle, but they're like neon lights once you start noticing them. They don't mean someone is a villain. They don't mean you're failing. They mean the conversation has structure, and that structure affects who has the steering wheel. Once you recognize these warning signs, you're no longer blindly reacting. You stop giving away your energy. You stop answering detours you didn't choose to follow. And that's exactly the point where awareness starts protecting you, even before you speak a single word. So let's recap. We've talked about the subtle ways conversations can steer you, without anyone raising their voice, emotional detours that pull you off topic, self-doubt injections that quietly destabilize your perception, false agreements that feel like progress but don't move anything, and the subtle warning signs that tell you when something's off before you're fully inside it. Once you notice these patterns, something interesting happens. You stop reacting unconsciously. You stop giving away your focus, and conversations start to feel clearer. Because awareness isn't about control. It's about choice. Here's the deeper takeaway. Manipulation is not a personal attack. It's a natural outcome of human interactions, and most people aren't even aware they're doing it. What changes everything is how you engage. When you start tracking energy shifts, noticing pressure, and pausing before responding, you reclaim the steering wheel. You don't need to argue, escalate, or fight. You just need to recognize the patterns and decide consciously where to invest your attention. If this video helped you start seeing conversations differently, here's what to do next. Hit the like button if you've ever walked away from a conversation feeling off and couldn't explain why. Subscribe and comment below. What's one moment in a conversation you later realized was a detour, and how did it make you feel? Let's start a discussion. You're not alone in this. Remember, awareness changes the conversation before a single word is spoken. And once you start noticing it, everything about how you engage shifts.